The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Margaret Chen straightened the last stack of client portfolios on her mahogany desk. 42 years. Tomorrow would mark exactly 4 decades plus 2 years since she'd first walked through the glass doors of Meridian Financial Solutions as a bright-eyed accounting assistant fresh out of college. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd be walking out those same doors for the final time in less than 12 hours. But this time, as Senior Vice President of Client Relations, the architect of the company's most successful client retention program in its 70-year history, I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The corner office on the 34th floor had been hers for the past 8 years, a testament to her relentless dedication and innovative approach to wealth management. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Chicago sprawled beneath her like a concrete ocean, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows between the towering skyscrapers. She'd watched this city grow and change from this very vantage point, had seen recessions come and go, had navigated market crashes that would have sunk lesser firms, and had built relationships with clients whose trust had become the bedrock of Meridian's reputation. Her retirement party was scheduled for 6 o'clock that evening. The banquet hall on the 40th floor had been reserved for weeks, caterers arranged, speeches prepared. Harold Whitmore, the CEO who'd hired her all those years ago, had promised to personally present her with the company's Lifetime Achievement Award, a crystal sculpture that would join the dozens of other accolades lining her office wall. Her team of 12 junior associates had spent the morning decorating the conference room with silver streamers and balloons, their genuine affection for their mentor evident in every carefully placed decoration. Margaret had never been one for sentimentality, but as she packed the last of her personal belongings into cardboard boxes, she couldn't help but feel a profound sense of accomplishment. The leather-bound client database sitting on her desk represented more than just names and account numbers. It was a living testament to the relationships she'd cultivated over 4 decades. Every entry told a story of trust earned, financial goals achieved, and lives changed for the better through careful planning and genuine care. The Pemberton family, whose modest savings she'd helped grow into a multi-million-dollar retirement fund. The Rodriguez couple, immigrants who'd arrived with nothing but determination and had built a successful chain of restaurants with her guidance. The Harrison tech startup that had gone public after following her strategic advice, creating jobs for hundreds of people across 3 states. These weren't just clients, they were chapters in the story of her career, proof that financial planning was about more than numbers on a spreadsheet. At 59, retirement felt both premature and perfectly timed. Her husband David had been after her for years to slow down, to spend more time at their cabin in Wisconsin, to travel to the places they'd always talked about visiting but never had the time to explore. Their daughter Sarah, now a successful pediatrician in Seattle, had been planning a family reunion for Margaret's retirement, bringing the grandchildren she rarely got to see due to her demanding schedule. The intercom on her desk crackled to life, interrupting her nostalgic reverie. "Miss Chen, Mr. Whitmore would like to see you in his office immediately." The voice belonged to Patricia Fleming, Harold's secretary for the past 15 years, but something in her tone seemed off. Usually warm and chatty, Patricia sounded formal, almost distant. Margaret glanced at her Cartier watch, a gift from the board of directors on her 20th anniversary with the company. 4:45 in the afternoon. The timing seemed odd, just over an hour before her retirement celebration was set to begin, but perhaps Harold wanted a private moment to thank her for her service before the formal festivities commenced. The executive elevator carried her smoothly to the 42nd floor, where the C-suite executives maintained their offices. The hallway was quieter than usual, the typical bustle of end-of-day activities, notably absent. Harold's corner office, larger even than hers, commanded a view of both the lake and the city skyline, a symbol of his position at the apex of Meridian's corporate hierarchy. Harold Whitmore stood behind his massive oak desk, his usually friendly demeanor replaced by something Margaret couldn't quite identify. At 67, he was a distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes that had always made him approachable despite his position. Today, however, those eyes couldn't quite meet hers as she entered the room. "Margaret, please sit down," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "We need to talk." The formality of his tone sent the first whisper of unease through her chest. In 4 decades of working together, Harold had never been anything but warm and personable with her. They'd shared countless conversations about strategy, about market trends, about their families and their hopes for the future. This stilted interaction felt completely foreign. "Is everything all right, Harold?" she asked, settling into the chair and noting how he still avoided direct eye contact. "You seem troubled." Harold cleared his throat and picked up a manila folder from his desk, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. "Margaret, I'm going to be direct with you, because I respect you too much to dance around this. The board met this morning in an emergency session, and we've made a decision regarding your position." The words hit her like a physical blow. "My position." "Harold, I'm retiring tomorrow." "What decision could there possibly be to make?" "That's just it," he said, finally looking at her directly. "The board feels that your transition needs to happen immediately. Tonight, before the party." Margaret felt the room spinning slightly around her. "I don't understand. What are you saying?" "Your replacement has already been selected and approved. He'll be taking over your responsibilities effective immediately, and frankly, the board feels it would be awkward to have a retirement celebration for someone who's no longer with the company in any capacity." The words seemed to echo in the vast office, each syllable hitting her with increasing force. "My replacement?" "Harold, we've discussed this transition for months. My team is prepared. The handover documentation is complete. The clients have all been notified of my retirement timeline. What could possibly have changed in the last 24 hours?" Harold's discomfort was palpable as he shifted in his chair. The board felt that bringing in fresh blood, someone with new ideas and contemporary approaches, would better serve our clients moving forward. "Fresh blood." Margaret's voice rose despite her efforts to maintain composure. "Harold, my client retention rate is 97%. I've brought in over $200 million in new business in the last 3 years alone. My team has the highest satisfaction ratings in the company. What exactly about my performance suggests that fresh blood is needed?" "It's not about performance, Margaret. It's about evolution. The financial services industry is changing rapidly, and the board believes we need someone who can navigate the digital transformation more effectively." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "Digital transformation?" "Harold, I've led 3 major technology upgrades in the last 5 years. I implemented the client portal system that increased our efficiency by 40%. I designed the mobile app that our competitors are still trying to copy. What are you really telling me here?" Harold's pause stretched uncomfortably long before he spoke again. "Your replacement is my nephew, Bradley Whitmore. He has an MBA from Wharton and extensive experience in fintech startups." The revelation hit Margaret like a sledgehammer. Everything suddenly became crystal clear, the pieces of this bizarre puzzle falling into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't about performance or digital transformation or fresh perspectives. This was about nepotism. Pure and simple. "Your nephew," she repeated slowly. "The same Bradley who worked here as a summer intern 2 years ago, the one who couldn't figure out how to use our basic client management software. Bradley has grown significantly since then. He's worked at several innovative firms and brings a completely different perspective to wealth management." Margaret's mind raced through the implications. "Harold, this is insane. You're terminating a 42-year veteran with the highest performance metrics in the company to install your nephew in a senior position he's completely unqualified for. Do you realize what this will do to client confidence?" "The decision has been made, Margaret. I'm sorry, but it's fine." The apology rang hollow in the spacious office. Margaret sat in stunned silence, trying to process not just the words but the complete betrayal they represented. 4 decades of loyalty, of sacrifice, of putting the company's interests above her own, and this was how it ended. Not with the dignified transition she'd planned, not with the recognition she'd earned, but with a summary dismissal to make room for an unqualified relative. "What about my team?" she asked quietly. "What about the clients who specifically requested to work with me? What about the projects we have in progress?" "Bradley will handle all of that. He's already been briefed on your major accounts." "Briefed by whom?" "I haven't briefed anyone on my client relationships because we agreed the transition would happen over the next 2 weeks." Harold's expression grew even more uncomfortable. We've had our analyst review your files and prepare summary reports for Bradley's review. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. You've been planning this for how long, Harold? How long have you been preparing to throw me aside like yesterday's newspaper? Margaret, please don't make this more difficult than it has to be. Difficult? She stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking. You want to talk about difficulty? I've given you the best years of my life. I've missed family dinners, skipped vacations, worked weekends and holidays to build this department into what it is today. I've mentored dozens of young professionals, built relationships with clients that span generations, and created systems and processes that generate millions in revenue for this company every year. And you're telling me that none of that matters because your nephew needs a job. Harold's face flushed red, but his voice remained steady. The board's decision is final, Margaret. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings, and HR will be in touch regarding your final compensation package. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Security escort. After 42 years of dedicated service, she was being treated like a common criminal who couldn't be trusted to clean out her own office. The humiliation was complete and devastating. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to light. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Margaret straightened her shoulders and looked Harold directly in the eye. You know what, Harold? I'm not even surprised. I've watched this company slowly lose its soul over the past few years, watched as quarterly profits became more important than client relationships, watched as loyalty became a liability rather than an asset. But I never thought you'd sink this low. She turned toward the door, then paused and looked back. 42 years, Harold. 42 years of my life I'll never get back. I hope your nephew was worth it. As she walked toward the elevator, her mind was already racing ahead to the immediate challenges she'd face, the retirement party that would now become an awkward farewell, the explanations she'd have to give to her family, the professional embarrassment of being terminated just hours before retirement. But beneath the hurt and anger, something else was beginning to stir. A determination that had carried her through 4 decades in the cutthroat world of finance was awakening. And Margaret Chen was far from finished with Meridian Financial Solutions. The elevator doors closed behind her with a soft ding, and she descended toward an uncertain future, unaware that the real story was just beginning to unfold. The security guard waiting by the elevator doors was someone Margaret had never seen before. Young, probably in his mid-20s, with the kind of stone-faced expression that suggested he'd been briefed on the situation and instructed to maintain professional distance. His name tag read, Officer Thompson, and the radio clipped to his shoulder crackled, occasionally with static-filled communications from other parts of the building. Mrs. Chen? His voice was respectful but firm. I've been asked to accompany you while you collect your personal item. The walk back to her office felt like a death march. The usual evening bustle of the 34th floor had quieted to a dull murmur, but Margaret could feel eyes following her progress down the hallway. Word traveled fast in corporate environments, and she suspected that news of her abrupt termination was already spreading through the building like wildfire. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as she passed, colleagues she'd worked with for years, suddenly finding their computer screens fascinating enough to require intense scrutiny. Jennifer Walsh, one of her junior associates, stood near the copy machine with a stack of party invitations in her hand. The young woman's face crumpled when she saw Margaret approaching with the security escort, understanding immediately what the scene meant. Jennifer had been with the company for only 3 years, but Margaret had taken her under her wing, mentoring her through the complex world of high-net-worth client management. Mrs. Chen? What's happening? Jennifer's voice carried a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. Margaret forced a smile that felt like it might crack her face. Change of plans, Jennifer. The party's been cancelled. Cancelled? But why? Everyone's already gathering upstairs. The caterers are setting up. Your husband called to confirm the timing. The mention of David hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. She'd have to call him, explain that the career celebration they'd been planning for months had been transformed into a corporate execution. He'd taken the afternoon off from his law practice, had driven into the city specifically to be there for her moment of triumph. Now she'd have to tell him there was nothing to celebrate. "I'll explain everything later," Margaret said, aware that Officer Thompson was listening to every word. "Could you please let everyone know that there won't be a party tonight?" Jennifer's eyes filled with tears she was clearly trying to suppress. "This isn't right. This isn't how things should end for you." Margaret squeezed the younger woman's shoulder. "Sometimes life doesn't follow the script we write for it. Take care of yourself, Jennifer. You're going to do great things." The interaction with Jennifer had attracted more attention. Other members of Margaret's team were emerging from their cubicles and offices, drawn by the unusual sight of their leader being escorted by security. Michael Torres, her second in command, approached with the kind of careful body language that suggested he was trying not to provoke the security guard. "Margaret, what's going on? Is there some kind of emergency?" Before she could answer, Patricia Fleming's voice echoed through the hallway. "Mrs. Chen, Mr. Whitmore asked me to inform you that you have exactly 30 minutes to collect your personal belongings. Anything remaining after that time will be boxed up and shipped to your home address." The announcement was loud enough that everyone within 50 feet could hear it clearly. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks as the implications sank in. Not only was she being terminated without warning, but she was being given a deadline to clear out 4 decades of accumulated memories and possession. The message was clear: she was no longer welcome in the building that had been her second home for most of her adult life. Her office door stood open, and Margaret could see that someone had already been inside. The cardboard boxes she'd been using to pack her personal items had been moved, and several items that she'd carefully wrapped and labeled were now sitting loose on her desk. Her computer monitor displayed a password reset screen, indicating that her access to company systems had already been revoked. "Has someone been going through my things?" she asked Officer Thompson. "I wouldn't know about that, ma'am. I was just asked to escort you during the collection process." Margaret moved to her desk and began gathering the photographs that had documented her journey through the company's ranks. The picture from her first promotion, standing next to Harold Whitmore when he still had dark hair and she wore the power suits that were fashionable in the 80s. The photo from the company's 50th anniversary celebration, where she'd been recognized as one of the top performers in the firm's history. The snapshot from last year's client appreciation dinner, where she stood surrounded by families whose financial futures she'd helped secure. Each photograph told a story, but as she placed them carefully in a box, Margaret realized that these moments now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The woman in these pictures had believed in corporate loyalty, had trusted that hard work and dedication would be rewarded, had assumed that decades of service would count for something when the time came to transition into retirement. Michael Torres appeared in her doorway, his expression gray. "Margaret, I just heard rumors about what happened upstairs. Please tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding." Margaret glanced at Officer Thompson, who was maintaining his professional distance, but clearly listening to every word. "It's not a misunderstanding, Mike. Apparently the board decided that my services are no longer required. That's impossible. Your retention rates, your client satisfaction scores, the revenue you generate. Margaret, you're the most successful senior executive this company has ever had." The compliment felt both validating and painfully ironic. Apparently success isn't the only factor in employment decisions. Michael's voice dropped to a whisper. "Is this about Bradley Whitmore?" There have been rumors for weeks that Harold was looking for a way to bring him into the company at a senior level. Margaret's hands stilled over the box she was packing. "What rumors?" "People have been Bradley's been seen in the building multiple times over the past month, meeting with board members, touring different departments. Sarah from HR mentioned that she'd been asked to prepare organizational charts showing potential restructuring scenarios." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. This termination hadn't been a sudden decision made in an emergency board meeting that morning. It had been planned, orchestrated, and executed with the kind of calculated precision that made her 4 decades of loyalty look like naive foolishness. "How long has this been in the works?" she asked quietly. "Based on what people have been whispering, for at least 6 weeks. Maybe longer." 6 weeks. Margaret felt sick as she realized the implications. For 6 weeks, while she'd been planning her retirement, transition, preparing handover documentation, and looking forward to her farewell celebration, Harold Whitmore and the board had been plotting her removal. Every conversation she'd had with Harold during that time, every discussion about succession planning and client transition strategies, had been theater. He'd known exactly when and how he intended to remove her from the company. Officer Thompson cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I need to remind you that you have 23 minutes remaining." Margaret nodded and returned to her packing with renewed urgency, but her mind was racing through the broader implications of what she'd just learned. If this termination had been planned for weeks, what else had been happening behind the scenes? Who else had known about the decision? What other changes were being implemented that she hadn't been informed about? She opened her desk drawer and began removing the personal items she'd accumulated over the years. A small jade plant that her daughter had given her for her promotion to vice president. A silver letter opener that had been a gift from her first major client. A stress ball shaped like a dollar sign that one of her junior associates had given her as a joke during a particularly challenging quarter. As she packed these small tokens of her professional life, Margaret became aware of a growing crowd gathering outside her office. Word of her termination had spread throughout the floor, and employees from various departments were finding excuses to walk past her door. Some looked shocked, others confused, and a few appeared genuinely angry about what they were witnessing. Thomas Kellerman, the head of the accounting department, and one of Margaret's closest allies in the company, pushed past Officer Thompson, despite the security guard's attempts to maintain crowd control. "Margaret, this is absolutely outrageous. I've been with this company for 28 years, and I've never seen anything this disgraceful. Harold should be ashamed of himself." "Thomas, please," Margaret said quietly, "don't make this harder than it already is." "Harder? Margaret, you built this department from nothing. When you started here, client relations was barely a functioning unit. You created the systems, developed the processes, trained the staff, and turned it into the most profitable division in the company. And they're just throwing you out like you're nobody." Officer Thompson stepped forward. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back and let Mrs. Chen complete her packing." Thomas's face flushed red with anger. "This is wrong on every level. Margaret, you should sue them. This has to be age discrimination, or retaliation, or something illegal. Companies can't just destroy people's careers on a whim." Margaret appreciated Thomas's loyalty, but she could see that his outburst was attracting even more attention. The last thing she wanted was to create a scene that would give Harold and the board additional ammunition to use against her. Corporate environments were political minefields, and she knew that any display of emotion or conflict would be used to justify their decision. "Thomas, I appreciate your support, but I need to focus on getting through this process with my dignity intact." Her words seemed to deflate some of his anger, but his expression remained furious. "Your dignity has never been in question, Margaret. It's their dignity that's been destroyed by this decision." As Margaret continued packing, she noticed that several items were missing from her office. The client appreciation plaques that had hung on her wall were gone. The leather-bound directory of her personal contacts was nowhere to be found. Most concerning of all, the backup hard drive where she kept copies of her most important client files had been removed from her desk drawer. "Officer Thompson," she said carefully, "it appears that some of my personal property has been removed from my office. Is there a procedure for recovering those items?" The security guard shifted uncomfortably. "I wouldn't have any information about that, ma'am. You'd need to speak with HR about any missing property." Margaret suspected that contacting HR would be futile, but the disappearance of her personal client files was deeply troubling. Those files contained not just account information, but detailed notes about client preferences, family situations, investment goals, and personal relationships that had taken years to develop. Without access to that information, whoever took over her accounts would be starting from scratch, potentially damaging relationships that had taken decades to build. The realization that her files had been systematically removed suggested a level of premeditation that went beyond simple nepotism. Someone had been planning not just her removal, but the complete erasure of her institutional knowledge and client relationships. The thought was both infuriating and deeply unsettling. Jennifer Walsh reappeared in the doorway, her face streaked with tears she was no longer trying to hide. "Mrs. Chen, I just called the catering company to cancel the party. They said someone had already called this morning to cancel everything, and that they'd been told to send the bill to accounting anyway. Margaret's hands froze over the box she was packing. Someone called this morning? Yes, around 10 o'clock. They said a woman called and explained that there had been a change in circumstances, and the event was no longer needed. 10 o'clock in the morning. Hours before Harold had called her to his office, hours before the supposed emergency board meeting, someone had already been canceling her retirement celebration. The level of calculation involved in orchestrating her termination was staggering. "Miss Chen," Officer Thompson said, consulting his watch, "you have 15 minutes remaining." Margaret looked around her office one final time, taking in the space that had been her professional home for 8 years. The view of downtown Chicago that had inspired her through countless late nights and weekend work sessions, the conference table where she'd negotiated deals worth millions of dollars, the bookshelf filled with industry publications and client gifts that represented decades of professional relationships. None of it belonged to her anymore. In less than 15 minutes, she'd walk out of this building for the final time, and someone else would occupy this space, make decisions at this desk, and build relationships with the clients she'd spent her career cultivating. But as Margaret packed the last of her personal belongings, she realized that while they could take her office, her title and her access to company systems, they couldn't take the knowledge she'd accumulated over 4 decades in the industry. They couldn't erase the relationships she'd built, or the reputation she'd earned through years of ethical practice and dedicated service. Harold Whitmore and his nephew might have won this battle, but Margaret Chen was beginning to understand that the war was far from over. As she sealed the final box of her belongings and prepared to leave Meridian Financial Solutions forever, she had no idea that the real drama was just beginning to unfold. The parking garage beneath Meridian Financial Solutions felt like a tomb. Margaret's heels echoed against the concrete as she made her way to her silver BMW, each step reverberating through the nearly empty space. The cardboard boxes containing the remnants of her professional life sat heavily in her arms, their weight seeming to increase with every stride. Officer Thompson had followed her down to ensure she left the premises, his presence a final reminder that she was now considered a security risk by the company she'd served faithfully for over 4 decades. The drive home to Winneta normally took 45 minutes in evening traffic, but tonight Margaret found herself taking the scenic route along Lakeshore Drive, needing time to process what had just happened. The lake stretched endlessly to the horizon, its surface reflecting the dying light of the autumn sun. She'd driven this route thousands of times over the years, usually thinking about client meetings, strategic initiatives or department challenges. Tonight her mind was blank, unable to fully grasp the magnitude of what had transpired. David's Volvo was already in the driveway when she pulled up to their Tudor-style home. Through the kitchen window, she could see him moving around, probably preparing dinner before they were supposed to head back into the city for her retirement celebration. The thought of explaining the day's events to her husband filled her with a dread that was almost physical in its intensity. She sat in her car for several minutes, staring at the house they'd purchased 23 years ago when her career had really begun to take off. The mortgage had been a stretch then, but Margaret's rising income had made it manageable, and over the years they'd transformed the property into their dream home. The garden that David tended with such care, the deck where they'd hosted countless barbecues for friends and colleagues, the home office, where she'd spent countless hours working on client presentations and strategic plans. All of it had been built on the foundation of her career at Meridian, and now that foundation had been ripped away without warning. The front door opened before she could gather the courage to get out of the car. David emerged, wiping his hands on a dish towel, his expression shifting from welcoming to concerned as he took in her early arrival and the boxes visible through the car's rear window. "Ma'am," he approached the driver's side, his voice carrying the kind of gentle worry that came from 31 years of marriage. "What's going on? I thought you wouldn't be home until after the party." Margaret turned off the engine and sat for a moment longer, trying to find the words to explain what had happened. How do you tell your husband that your entire professional identity had been obliterated in a single afternoon? How do you admit that the retirement celebration he'd been looking forward to for months had been transformed into a corporate assassination? "There's not going to be a party," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. David's expression darkened immediately. What do you— Did something happen? Are you sick? Margaret finally opened the car door and stepped out, feeling suddenly exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. I was terminated this afternoon, about 2 hours ago. The words hung in the cool October air like a physical presence. David stared at her, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally anger. Terminated? That's impossible. You're retiring tomorrow. You've given them months of notice. Prepared all the transition materials. His voice trailed off as reality began to sink in. Maggie, what happened? Margaret moved to the back of the car and began removing the boxes, partly because they needed to be carried inside, and partly because she needed something to do with her hands. Harold called me to his office, said the board had decided to make an immediate change. My replacement starts tomorrow. David took one of the heavier boxes from her hands, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. Your replacement? Who could possibly replace you? You've built that entire department from scratch. Harold's nephew, Bradley, the one who interned there a couple years ago. David nearly dropped the box. The kid who couldn't figure out how to work the coffee machine. The one who asked you if clients really expected him to remember their names. Margaret nodded, unable to trust her voice. Hearing David articulate the absurdity of the situation somehow made it even more surreal. They carried the boxes inside in silence, stacking them in the living room next to the fireplace. The house felt different somehow, as if her professional humiliation had somehow contaminated the space that had always been their sanctuary. David disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 2 glasses of wine, handing one to Margaret before settling beside her on the couch. Tell me everything, he said quietly. Margaret found herself recounting the afternoon's events in clinical detail, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. The unexpected summons to Harold's office, the revelation about Bradley's appointment, the security escort, the discovery that her termination had been planned for weeks. David listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each new detail. This is age discrimination, he said finally. It's also potentially fraud if they've been planning this while letting you continue to work under false pretenses. Maggie, you need to sue them. This is exactly the kind of case that employment attorneys live for. Margaret had been expecting this reaction. David was a litigator by nature and profession, someone who believed that legal systems existed to address injustice. But she'd spent 4 decades navigating corporate politics, and she understood the realities of fighting a company with unlimited resources, and a legal department that specialized in protecting the firm from exactly these kinds of challenges. With what evidence? She asked. Everything I could use to prove my case is sitting in company files that I no longer have access to. My computer has been wiped, my personal files have been confiscated, and I'm sure they've already started crafting a narrative about why my termination was justified. Then we find other evidence. There have to be witnesses, emails, documentation that proves this was premeditated. Margaret appreciated his fighting spirit, but she also understood something that David didn't. Meridian Financial Solutions had been preparing for this battle longer than she'd been aware one was coming. They'd had weeks to cover their tracks, secure their documentation, and prepare their defenses. She'd had 2 hours to pack her personal belongings and try to maintain her dignity. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Jennifer Walsh, Mrs. Chen. Something strange is happening. They've called an all-hands meeting for the first thing tomorrow morning. Also, the new VP is already in your office going through everything. I'm so sorry this is happening to you. Margaret showed the message to David, who read it with increasing agitation. They're moving fast to consolidate control and control the narrative. This is not how legitimate business transitions happen. Before Margaret could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name of Robert Harrison, CEO of Harrison Tech Solutions, and one of her most important clients. She'd been managing the Harrison family's wealth for over 15 years, helping them navigate the transition from startup founders to established business leaders. Robert, she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. Margaret, I just got the strangest call from someone at Meridian claiming to be my new account manager. A kid named Bradley. Something. He said you'd been reassigned and that he'd be handling our portfolio going forward. Please tell me this is some kind of mistake. Margaret felt her stomach drop. I'm afraid it's not a mistake, Robert. I was terminated from Meridian this afternoon. The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably long. When Robert finally spoke, his voice was tight with anger. Terminate, Margaret, you're the best financial advisor I've ever worked with. You've made my family millions of dollars over the years. What possible reason could they have for terminating you? Corporate restructuring, Margaret said, using the euphemism that would probably become the company's official explanation. That's corporate speak for we don't want to tell you the real reason, Robert said bluntly. Margaret, I want you to know that the Harrison family will not be working with Meridian Financial Solutions going forward. We've been clients for 15 years, but our relationship was with you, not with the company. If you're not there, we're not there. The statement was both gratifying and terrifying. Margaret appreciated Robert's loyalty, but she also understood the implications of what he was saying. If other clients followed suit, Meridian could lose millions in assets under management, and the company would undoubtedly blame her for the exodus. Robert, I appreciate your loyalty, but I don't want you to make any hasty decisions about your portfolio. Your family's financial security is more important than any personal loyalties. Margaret, you don't understand. My wife and I have been talking about this for months. We knew you were planning to retire, and we'd already discussed following you to whatever firm you joined next. This just accelerates our timeline. After ending the call, Margaret sat in stunned silence. She hadn't considered the possibility that her termination might trigger a mass exodus of clients. Over the years, she'd built relationships that transcended the corporate structure, but she'd always assumed that the institutional stability of Meridian would keep clients anchored to the company, even after her departure. David was watching her with concern. What was that about? Robert Harrison is pulling his family's accounts from Meridian. He wants to follow me to whatever firm I join next. That's good news, isn't it? It means you have options. Margaret wasn't sure it was good news. Client defections on a large scale could trigger legal challenges from Meridian, claims of client solicitation or breach of fiduciary duty. Companies routinely sued departing employees who took clients with them, and Margaret's termination could be framed as a reason to pursue aggressive legal action. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Patricia Fleming, Harold's secretary. Margaret, I'm so sorry about what happened today. I've been Harold's secretary for 15 years, and I've never seen him look so uncomfortable about a decision. I think you should know that Bradley Whitmore was in the building until almost midnight last night, and he was back again at 6 this morning. Whatever they're planning, it's bigger than just your replacement. Margaret showed the message to David, who read it with growing alarm. What do you think she means by bigger than just your replacement? Before Margaret could respond, her phone rang again. This time the caller was Thomas Kellerman from accounting, the colleague who had confronted the security guard in her office. Margaret, I'm calling from home because I don't want to have this conversation from the office. Something very strange is happening here, and I think you need to know about it. What kind of strange? I've been asked to prepare financial reports that I've never been asked to prepare before. Detailed breakdowns of client account values, revenue attribution by advisor, profit margins by department. It's the kind of analysis you'd do if you were planning major restructuring, or if you were preparing for an acquisition. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. An acquisition? I don't know for sure, but the data they're asking for would be exactly what a potential buyer would want to see. Asset values, revenue streams, growth projections, and they want it all prepared by tomorrow morning. The implications were staggering. If Meridian was being acquired, Margaret's termination might not have been about nepotism at all. It might have been about removing a high-salary employee before a sale to make the company's financials look more attractive to potential buyers. Thomas, are you sure about this? I've been doing financial analysis for this company for 28 years, Margaret. I know what acquisition preparation looks like. And there's something else. I was asked to prepare a report showing what our profit margins would look like if we eliminated several senior-level positions. Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Which positions? I can't say for sure, but the salary ranges they asked me to analyze correspond to most of the senior management team. Margaret, I think they're planning to clean the house. After ending the call, Margaret sat in stunned silence. The day that had started as a simple case of nepotism was revealing itself to be something much more complex and potentially devastating. If Meridian was being sold, her termination might be just the beginning of a massive restructuring that would affect dozens of employees and hundreds of clients. David was watching her with growing concern. "Maggie, what's going on?" Margaret looked at her husband, the man who had supported her career for over 3 decades, who had been looking forward to finally having her home full-time, who had been planning the retirement they'd both been dreaming about for years. "I think I've stumbled into something much bigger than my own termination," she said quietly, "and I think Harold Whitmore is way over his head." As if summoned by her words, Margaret's phone rang one final time. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice was familiar. "Mrs. Chen, this is Bradley Whitmore. I think we need to talk." The coffee shop on Sheridan Road was nearly empty at 8 o'clock on a Thursday evening. Margaret had chosen Brew and Beans specifically because it was far from downtown Chicago, away from any location where Meridian employees might frequent. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across the worn wooden tables, and the smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air like an unwelcome presence. She'd arrived 15 minutes early, positioning herself at a corner table with clear sightlines to both entrances, her instincts from decades of business negotiations automatically kicking in despite the surreal nature of the situation. Bradley Whitmore walked through the front door at exactly 8:15, and Margaret was struck by how different he looked from the awkward intern she remembered from 2 years ago. Gone was the uncertain posture and ill-fitting suit. The young man approaching her table moved with confidence, wore an expensive charcoal gray suit that fit perfectly, and carried himself like someone who belonged in executive boardrooms. His dark hair was styled professionally, and his handshake when he reached her table was firm and direct. "Miss Chen, thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know this situation must be incredibly difficult for you." Margaret studied his face carefully, looking for signs of the arrogance or entitlement she'd expected from someone who had just stolen her job through family connection. Instead, she saw something that surprised her: genuine remorse, mixed with what appeared to be fear. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully, "I have to admit I'm curious about why you wanted this meeting. Congratulations are in order, I suppose. You've managed to land one of the most coveted positions in Chicago financial services." Bradley's expression darkened as he settled into the chair across from her. "That's exactly what I need to talk to you about. Miss Chen, I think we're both being played, and I think the situation is much more dangerous than either of us realized." Margaret felt her pulse quicken but kept her expression neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean." Bradley glanced around the coffee shop nervously, then leaned forward and lowered his voice. 3 months ago I was working at a small fintech startup in San Francisco, barely making enough to cover my rent. I hadn't spoken to my Uncle Harold in over 2 years. Then suddenly he calls me out of the blue, offers me a senior position at Meridian, and tells me it's contingent on absolute secrecy and complete loyalty to his vision for the company's future. "That's an interesting career opportunity," Margaret said dryly. "Most people would be thrilled by that kind of nepotistic advancement." "That's what I thought initially," Bradley said quickly. "But Mrs. Chen, the more I learned about what Harold has planned, the more I realized that I'm not being given an opportunity. I'm being used as a pawn in something much bigger and much more destructive than I ever imagined." Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying the young man's face for signs of deception. "What exactly do you think you're being used for?" Bradley pulled out his phone and showed her a series of text messages. "These are from Harold over the past week. Read them." Margaret took the phone and scrolled through the conversation. The messages were cryptic but troubling. "Remember, your loyalty is to the new vision, not the old guard. The transition needs to be complete and irreversible. Certain employees have knowledge that could complicate our timeline. Client relationships built over decades can be rebuilt in months, with the right approach." "What timeline is he referring to?" Margaret asked, handing the phone back. "Mrs. Chen, Meridian Financial Solutions is being sold. The deal was finalized 2 weeks ago, but it won't be announced until next month. The acquiring company is Apex Capital Management, and they specialize in buying established financial services firms, stripping out the high-cost employees, and converting the client base to automated investment platforms. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Apex Capital Management was notorious in the industry for exactly the kind of aggressive cost-cutting that Bradley was describing. They'd acquired 7 smaller firms over the past 5 years, and in each case, they'd eliminated between 60 and 80% of the existing staff within 6 months of the purchase. Harold is selling the company. Harold doesn't have a choice. Meridian has been operating at a loss for the past 18 months. The board gave him an ultimatum: find a buyer or face bankruptcy proceeding. Apex offered him a deal that would allow him to maintain a leadership position in the merged company, but only if he could demonstrate that the transition would be smooth and cost-effective. Margaret's mind raced through the implication. And eliminating high-salary senior employees like me makes the deal more attractive to Apex. Exactly. But Mrs. Chen, there's something else you need to know. Apex isn't just planning to eliminate senior staff, they're planning to liquidate the entire client services model that you built. Everything you've created over the past 4 decades is going to be replaced by automated algorithms and call center representatives. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. The client relationship she'd spent her career building, the personalized service model that had made Meridian successful, the human approach to wealth management that had generated hundreds of millions in assets under management, all of it was going to be destroyed in the name of operational efficiency. How do you know all this? Bradley's expression grew even more troubled. Because I've been attending the transition planning meeting. Harold told me that my job would be to help facilitate the conversion process, to identify which client relationships could be maintained through automated systems, and which ones would require more aggressive retention strategy. Chen, they're planning to lock clients into new contracts that would make it extremely difficult and expensive to transfer their assets to other firms. They want to trap people in the system before they realize how dramatically the service model is changing. Margaret felt a surge of anger that was almost overwhelming. That's essentially fraud. Those clients trust Meridian because of the personal relationships they've built with advisors like me. If the company is planning to eliminate that service model without fully disclosing the changes, they're violating their fiduciary duty. I know, Bradley said quietly. That's why I asked to meet with you. Miss Chen, I may have accepted this position, but I never agreed to participate in defrauding clients or destroying the careers of people who've dedicated their lives to this company. Margaret studied the young man across from her, trying to reconcile what he was telling her with her assumptions about his motivations. If that's true, then why did you accept the position? Why didn't you refuse Harold's offer? Bradley was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that seemed genuine. Because I was desperate, and because I thought I could make a difference from the inside. Mrs. Chen, I've been trying to break into financial services for 3 years. Every firm I applied to told me I lacked experience. Every interview ended with suggestions that I start in entry-level positions that paid less than I made waiting tables in college. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. When Harold offered me this opportunity, I thought it was a chance to prove myself, to show that I could contribute meaningfully to a company with a real reputation. I didn't realize until I was already committed that I was being hired specifically to help dismantle everything that made that reputation worth having. Margaret found herself believing him despite her initial skepticism. What changed your mind? Yesterday I sat in a meeting where Harold and the Apex transition team discussed which clients would be worth retaining and which ones could be allowed to leave without aggressive retention efforts. Miss Chen, they have a spreadsheet that categorizes every client based on account value, age, and likelihood to accept reduced service levels. Bradley pulled out a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table. I printed this before I left the office tonight. I probably shouldn't have, but I thought you deserved to know what they're planning. Margaret opened the folder and found herself looking at a detailed analysis of Meridian's client base. The spreadsheet contained hundreds of names, many of whom she recognized as people she'd worked with for years or even decades. Each client was assigned a color code: green for high value, low maintenance, yellow for moderate value, retention efforts worthwhile, and red for low profitability, natural attrition acceptable. As she scrolled through the list, Margaret felt the Rodriguez family, whose small business she'd helped grow into a multi-million-dollar operation, was marked in red. The Pemberton account, representing 3 generations of careful wealth building, was coded yellow with a note that read, elderly clients, limited growth potential. Even Robert Harrison, whose tech company had generated enormous fees for Meridian over the years, was marked green but with annotations suggesting that his account could be managed effectively through automated systems. "This is unconscionable," Margaret said quietly. "These aren't just account numbers, these are families, people who've trusted Meridian with their financial futures." "I know, and Mrs. Chen, there's something else. Apex has specifically instructed Harold to prevent any senior employees from taking client relationships with them when they leave. They're planning to implement non-compete agreements retroactively, and to pursue aggressive legal action against anyone who they believe is soliciting Meridian clients." Margaret thought about Robert Harrison's phone call earlier that evening, his declaration that the Harrison family would be leaving Meridian to follow her wherever she went next. If what Bradley was telling her was true, her former employer might already be building a case to claim that she was improperly soliciting clients. "How much time do we have before the acquisition is announced?" 3 weeks, maybe 4. Harold is pushing for the announcement to coincide with the end of the fiscal quarter, so he can present the sale as a strategic decision rather than a financial necessity. Margaret closed the folder and looked directly at Bradley. "Why are you telling me? What do you expect me to do with this information?" Bradley's answer surprised her. "I want to help you stop it." "Stop it?" "Bradley, this is a done deal. The contracts have been signed, the regulatory approvals are in process. You can't stop a corporate acquisition just because you don't like the business plan." "Maybe not," Bradley said, "but we might be able to expose the fraudulent aspects of the transition plan." "Miss Chen, if Apex is planning to lock clients into new service agreements without fully disclosing how drastically the service model is changing, that's securities. If they're categorizing clients for differential treatment based on age or account value, that could violate fiduciary duty regulations." Margaret felt a spark of hope for the first time since her termination. "You're talking about whistleblowing. That's an incredibly risky proposition for someone in your position." "I understand the risks, but Mrs. Chen, I've seen your client files. I've read the testimonials from families whose lives you've changed for the better. I've reviewed the performance metrics that show how successful your approach to wealth management has been. What Apex is planning isn't just bad business, it's destructive to real people who've worked their entire lives to build financial security." Margaret studied Bradley's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motivations. What she saw instead was something she hadn't expected: genuine integrity, mixed with the kind of idealistic determination that she remembered from her own early years in the industry. "What exactly are you proposing?" Bradley leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I have access to all of the transition planning documents, meeting minutes, client categorization spreadsheets, timeline projections, communication strategy, everything that would prove what Apex and Harold are really planning. That information is probably protected by confidentiality agreements and corporate security protocols. Accessing it could be considered corporate espionage." "I'm not talking about stealing information, Mrs. Chen. I'm talking about documenting violations of fiduciary duty and securities regulations. If Apex is planning to defraud clients, then exposing that plan isn't espionage. It's protecting the victims of financial fraud." Margaret felt her pulse quickening as she realized the implications of what Bradley was suggesting. "You're talking about building a case that could bring down the entire acquisition." "I'm talking about protecting the clients who trusted you to look out for their interests, even if you're no longer officially in a position to do so." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering the proposal. The risks were enormous. If they were wrong about the legal implications of Apex's plans, or if they couldn't prove their allegations, both she and Bradley could face serious legal consequences. But if they were right, they might be able to prevent the destruction of relationships and service standards that had taken decades to build. "If we're going to do this," she said finally, "we need to be absolutely certain about our legal ground, and we need to move fast before the acquisition progresses too far to stop." Bradley smiled for the first time since he'd entered the coffee shop. "Mrs. Chen, I was hoping you'd say that, because I think I know exactly how we can prove everything." 3 days after the coffee shop meeting, Margaret found herself in the most unlikely situation of her professional life, sitting in the passenger seat of Bradley Whitmore's Tesla, parked across the street from Meridian Financial Solutions at 2 o'clock in the morning. The downtown Chicago streets were eerily quiet, with only the occasional taxi or delivery truck breaking the silence. The office building's windows glowed with the dim light of emergency lighting, creating a checkerboard pattern against the dark sky. Bradley had spent the previous 72 hours gathering evidence from inside the company, documenting the full scope of Apex Capital Management's plans for dismantling Meridian's client service model. What they'd discovered was worse than either of them had initially imagined. The acquisition wasn't just about cost-cutting, it was about asset stripping on a massive scale, designed to extract maximum value from client relationships while providing minimal service in return. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Margaret asked, studying the building's security patterns through a pair of binoculars that Bradley had somehow acquired. "Once we cross this line, there's no going back." Bradley's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "Miss Chen, I've spent the last 3 days sitting in meetings where they discussed clients like they were commodities to be harvested. This morning, I watched Harold sign off on a communication strategy designed to mislead every major account holder about the changes coming to their service agreement." Margaret lowered the binoculars and looked at the young man beside her. Over the past 3 days, she'd watched him transform from a conflicted beneficiary of nepotism into a determined whistleblower. The evidence he'd gathered was damning: internal emails discussing strategies to maximize client retention during service degradation, spreadsheets calculating optimal fee increases that clients would tolerate before seeking alternative providers, and most damaging of all, legal memoranda exploring ways to make client account transfers as difficult and expensive as possible. "The database server is on the 36th floor," Bradley said, checking his watch. "Security changes shifts at 2:15, which gives us a 12-minute window before the new guard does his first round." Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness that she hadn't experienced since her first job interview 4 decades earlier. "Remind me again how you got access to the building's security codes." Patricia Fleming, Harold's secretary. Apparently she's been documenting everything Harold has done over the past 2 months, and she's been waiting for the right moment to act. "When I approached her yesterday, she was ready with everything we needed." Patricia Fleming's involvement had been the breakthrough they'd needed. As Harold's longtime secretary, she had access to his calendar, his communications, and most importantly, his security credentials. More critically, she'd been quietly documenting Harold's activities since the acquisition negotiations began, creating a detailed record of meetings, phone calls, and decisions that painted a clear picture of systematic deception. "She's taking an enormous risk," Margaret said. "We're all taking enormous risks, but Mrs. Chen, if we don't act tonight, by Monday morning Apex will have implemented new security protocols that will make accessing this information impossible." The plan they'd developed was both simple and audacious. Bradley would use his legitimate access to enter the building, while Margaret would follow using Patricia's security credentials. Once inside, they would access the central database servers and copy the complete client information system. Not just the sanitized reports that Apex planned to use for the transition, but the full database including Margaret's detailed client notes, relationship histories, and strategic recommendations that Meridian planned to suppress. Their goal wasn't theft, it was preservation. If Apex succeeded in implementing their new service model, 40 years of institutional knowledge about client relationships would be lost forever. Families like the Rodriguez clan, whose multi-generational wealth management strategies required deep understanding of family dynamics and cultural preferences, would be reduced to algorithm-driven investment recommendations. High-net-worth clients like the Harrison family, whose complex business structures required sophisticated coordination between multiple financial instruments, would be served by call center representatives reading from script. Bradley's phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia. "Coast clear. Harold left the building 20 minutes ago. No unusual security activity. This is it," Bradley said, opening his car door. "Remember, if anything goes wrong, you've never met me, and you were never here." Margaret followed him across the empty street, her heart pounding with a combination of fear and excitement that reminded her of the early days of her career when every challenge had felt like an adventure. The building's lobby was dimly lit, monitored by security cameras that Bradley had assured her were on a loop that Patricia had arranged. The elevator ride to the 36th floor felt endless. Margaret found herself thinking about the irony of the situation. 48 hours after being escorted from this building as a security risk, she was returning as an actual security risk, planning to copy confidential information that could bring down a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. "Mrs. Chen," Bradley said quietly as the elevator climbed, "I want you to know that whatever happens tonight, working with you has been the most meaningful thing I've done in my professional life." Margaret looked at the young man beside her, seeing something of her younger self in his determination to do the right thing regardless of the personal cost. "Bradley, 20 years from now, when you're sitting in a corner office making decisions that affect hundreds of people's lives, remember this feeling. Remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything." The 36th floor housed Meridian's information technology infrastructure, a maze of server rooms and database storage systems that contained the digital heart of the company's operation. Bradley led Margaret through corridors lined with humming computer equipment, using keycards and access codes that Patricia had provided to navigate the security checkpoint. "The main client database is in here," Bradley said, stopping in front of a heavy steel door marked "Tourstied Personnel Only." He swiped Patricia's master keycard and entered a 12-digit code, and the door clicked open with a soft electronic chime. The server room was cold and filled with the constant hum of cooling fans and hard drives. Rows of black computer towers stretched from floor to ceiling, their status lights blinking in complex patterns that suggested the constant flow of data processing and storage operation. "How do we know which servers contain the client information?" Margaret asked, overwhelmed by the complexity of the setup. Bradley pulled out a tablet computer and connected it to one of the server consoles. Patricia provided detailed schematics of the data storage system. "The client relationship management database is distributed across these 6 servers," he said, pointing to a cluster of machines near the center of the room. What happened next would later be described by federal investigators as one of the most sophisticated data preservation operations in corporate whistleblowing history. Bradley had come prepared with military-grade encryption software and quantum storage devices that could copy terabytes of information in minutes rather than hours. But as he began the download process, Margaret noticed something that made her blood run cold. "Bradley, look at this," she said, pointing to one of the monitoring screens that displayed real-time database activity. "Someone else is accessing the client files right now." Bradley rushed to the console and began typing frantically, his face growing pale as he read the information displayed on the screen. "Mrs. Chen, someone is systematically deleting client records. Look at these timestamps. They started the deletion process about 20 minutes ago." Margaret watched in horror as the screen displayed a continuous stream of file deletions, client account histories, relationship notes, strategic recommendations, communication logs. 40 years of accumulated knowledge about client relationships was being systematically erased in real time. "Can you stop it?" she asked urgently. "I can try, but whoever is doing this has administrator-level access. They're not just deleting files, they're overwriting the storage sectors to make recovery impossible." Bradley's fingers flew across the keyboard as he attempted to interrupt the deletion process, but the destruction continued relentlessly. Margaret watched as the digital record of her life's work disappeared before her eyes, each deleted file representing relationships and knowledge that could never be recreated. "There," Bradley said suddenly, "I've isolated the deletion command. It's coming from Harold's personal access account, but the commands are being executed from a remote location. Harold is doing this, either Harold or someone using his credentials. Mrs. Chen, this isn't random. Someone knew we were planning to access this information tonight, and they're destroying the evidence before we can preserve it." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the server room's temperature. "How many people knew about our plan?" "Just us and Patricia." Bradley paused, his expression growing troubled. "Unless," before he could finish the thought, the server room's emergency lighting activated, bathing everything in red light. An alarm began sounding throughout the building, and Margaret could hear the distant sound of multiple vehicles arriving in the street outside. "We've been set up," Bradley said grimly, Someone knew exactly when and where we'd be. Margaret's mind raced through the possibility. Had Patricia betrayed them? Had Harold suspected his nephew's true loyalties? Or was this part of an even larger conspiracy designed to eliminate anyone who might threaten the Apex acquisition? How much of the database were you able to copy before the deletion started? Bradley checked his tablet. Maybe 30%, enough to prove that the client categorization system exists, but not enough to reconstruct the relationship histories that would be needed to provide continuity of service. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside was getting loud. Margaret realized that they had perhaps minutes before security forces reached the server room, but as she looked at the continuing stream of deletions on the monitoring screen, she understood that the real crime wasn't their presence in the building. It was the systematic destruction of information that belonged to clients who had trusted Meridian with their financial future. Bradley, we need to document what's happening here. Even if we can't save the database, we can prove that it was deliberately destroyed. Bradley nodded and began recording video of the deletion process, capturing timestamps and administrative logs that showed the systematic nature of the data destruction. As he worked, Margaret found herself thinking about all the clients whose trust was being betrayed by these actions. The Rodriguez family, who had relied on detailed notes about their cultural preferences and family dynamics to guide their investment strategies. The Pemberton clan, whose multi-generational wealth transfer plans required careful documentation of family relationships and succession preferences. Mrs. Chen, Bradley said urgently, "We need to leave now. I can hear security teams on this floor." As they prepared to evacuate the server room, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Instead of fleeing immediately, she approached the main server console and initiated her own command sequence. "What are you doing?" Bradley asked. "If they're going to destroy the client database, I'm going to make sure they can't use what's left for fraudulent purposes," Margaret said, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. What Margaret had realized was that while the relationship histories and strategic notes were being deleted, the core account information, names, addresses, account values and contact information, was being preserved. This was exactly the information that Apex would need to implement their client retention strategy, the data that would allow them to lock clients into new service agreements before those clients understood how dramatically their service levels would be reduced. Margaret's final act as a Meridian employee was to encrypt the remaining client contact information with a security protocol that would make it inaccessible to anyone who didn't have both her personal access codes and her decades of knowledge about client preferences and family structure. "There," she said, stepping back from the console. "Let's see them try to implement their retention strategy without knowing how to contact their own client." As security forces began pounding on the server room door, Margaret and Bradley made their escape through a maintenance corridor that Patricia had identified in her building schematic. They emerged into the Chicago dawn as changed people. Margaret was no longer a corporate executive seeking to preserve her legacy, and Bradley was no longer a young professional trying to advance his career. They had become something more dangerous to corporate corruption. They had become witnesses with evidence, and they had just struck a blow against the acquisition that would reverberate through boardrooms and regulatory agencies for months to come. The battle for the soul of Meridian Financial Solutions was far from over, but as Margaret and Bradley disappeared into the morning traffic, they both understood that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The database was gone, but the evidence of its deliberate destruction would soon become the foundation for one of the largest corporate fraud investigations in financial services history. And in conference rooms across Chicago, Apex Capital Management executives were about to discover that acquiring a company was much easier than controlling the dedicated employees who had built its reputation one client relationship at a time. We've got two amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest upload.